I'm Danielle Lipinski. I'm with the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Today, thank you so much for joining us for our telemedia conference, which we will release our 2020 Environmental Scorecard. Our speakers today are Kim Coble, Executive Director of Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and our Deputy Executive Director and CHISPA Maryland Director, Ramon Palencia Calvo. For the media on the call today, your microphone will be muted until our speakers have gone through their brief remarks. And then after we hear from our speakers, we will take questions from the media. Thank you so much again for joining us today. And now I will hand it off to Kim Coble, Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you all for joining us today as we release our 2020 Environmental Scorecard. Before we jump in, I want to acknowledge the hard work that the Maryland LCV staff have put into producing this document. It's been months and months of data crunching and hard work, and I want to specifically thank Kristen Harbison for her leadership on it. You can find the 2020 Environmental Scorecard at our website, www.mdlcv.org, and click on Take Action to locate it. Additionally, we've added a new tool to our website called the Conservation Voter Report. And this report allows you to find your legislator, look at their scores historically and in the current year. And we're hoping that will enable our members and interested public to become more educated about their voter or their elected officials' voting record. The Environmental Scorecard is a signature project of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And over the past 4 decades, we have served as the leading environmental organization in Maryland, working to hold our elected officials accountable for their votes by individually scoring hundreds of legislators and bills. The 2020 scorecard is different, as unfortunately is almost everything about this past year. In 2020, for the first time since the Civil War, the Maryland General Assembly adjourned early because of the unprecedented coronavirus pandemic. Delegates, senators, and their staffs showed leadership in helping Maryland respond to 2 crises, COVID-19 and the national crisis around racial injustice. But all Marylanders should be disappointed that the General Assembly did not respond to our 3rd crisis, climate change, and specifically its impact on communities of color. In fact, the General Assembly almost passed 0 bills that would make Maryland more resilient to future calamities and to climate change impacts that we're already facing. Because the session adjourned early and the disruption to the hearing and voting process that occurred, we did not give individual lawmakers grades in our scorecard this year. Instead, we decided the most accurate representation of what happened during the 2020 session would be to apply a pass-fail grading system to each chamber, the Senate and the House, and an overall grade to the General Assembly in its entirety. Each section of our scorecard provides which bills were evaluated, and the grades themselves are based on the actions that the General Assembly took on each bill. To summarize, we gave the General Assembly passing grades in the categories dealing with water, agriculture, and resiliency legislation. But the legislature's decision not to advance any climate or transportation bill are the most consequential failing of the 2020 General Assembly. Accordingly, we gave the General Assembly Fs in the categories of climate and transportation. And I want to say this very clearly. To make real progress in 2021, the General Assembly has to take meaningful steps to reduce the impacts of climate change, especially through addressing transportation, the largest source of greenhouse gas in Maryland. And it needs and by doing so, these actions will simultaneously help address the pollution and other environmental burdens that disproportionately affect our low-income communities of color. So in 2021, we're asking the General Assembly to do the following. In the area of climate legislation, they need to pass a comprehensive bill that aggressively reduces greenhouse gas emissions, advances energy efficiency, and reduces methane leakage. The General Assembly also needs to pass key transportation bills that include transit funding to address the backlog of maintenance and operation needs. It needs to ensure that the revenue from the Regional Transportation and Climate Initiative, TCI, is spent on programs that reduce greenhouse gases and is targeted to low-income neighborhoods. And finally, the state must also pass environmental justice legislation that will reduce pollution and advance equity and racial justice. One of Maryland LCV's top priorities for the 2021 session is cumulative impact legislation that will require that all permits issued by the state include, all environmental permits that are issued by the state include an assessment of potential impacts on all communities, regardless of demographics or socioeconomic status. There are a range of other steps the General Assembly must also take to address environmental threats that disproportionately threaten Maryland's communities of color and low-income communities. And to discuss those steps, I'll now hand it off to Ramon Palencia Calvo. Ramon?
Thank you very much, Kim. In recent months, we have seen how the pandemic has brought to the forefront the environmental injustices that communities of color and low-income communities face not just in Maryland, but around the country. Recent studies have linked higher death rates from COVID-19 to areas with higher levels of air pollution, making us acutely aware of the effects that decades of racist policies, such as those that have placed industry and other sources of pollution on Black and brown communities have had. When we compound this injustice with other social and economic injustices, such as unemployment, discriminatory housing practices, food deserts, lack of healthy and green spaces, and inadequate health care, it is easy to understand why those communities are at a much higher risk when facing this tragic pandemic. It has been almost 20 years since we passed meaningful environmental justice legislation in Maryland. We are beyond overdue to address those environmental injustices and uplift those communities that have suffered for too long. As Kim mentioned, moving forward, our legislators must make cumulative impacts assessments a requirement when considering permits to pollute. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of Maryland's Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Commissions. This commission needs to be reimagined to have a stronger mandate and real voices from impacted communities to address and advise legislators on how to eliminate environmental injustices in Maryland. And we also need to ensure that host communities are consulted and part of the decisions that affect their health and their well-being. In the big picture, our goal is to ensure that our frontline communities benefit from legislation that reduces emissions in their neighborhoods, while also bringing sustainable and economic development to those neighborhoods and communities. Maryland LCV and our partners will be working hard this session to ensure our legislators make those goals a reality for environmental justice communities. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Kim and Ramon. So now I'm going to unmute you in the attendees. So if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, and we can ask, and you can ask us anything that we may not have covered. So I have one in the chat. Have you talked with members of the General Assembly about the scorecard?
Thank you for the question. We actually have talked with leadership about the scorecard and the results and briefed them, as well as committee leaders, and gave notice to everybody in the General Assembly we were releasing it today. You know, nobody likes a report card. On the other hand, they also understand the importance that this tool plays, especially with our members and citizens that are engaged in the environment. They also appreciate understanding the priorities of Maryland LCV and the community. So this is, again, this scorecard is something we've done for decades, and it has played a really critical role in being able to have us communicate with the legislators and with our members and public about the importance of environmental bills. We use it also to help drive our endorsement process during the election and to help keep voters informed. So maybe they don't particularly like us grading them, but they do understand the role and the importance that the tool plays.
Thank you for that, Kim. Yeah, so if there are not any other questions, we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks again for joining us today for our...
Danny, it looks like a question came in, another one there in the chat. What are some of the biggest agenda items for next session? And are these impacted by what's going on the national front? Good question. Just to summarize again, Maryland LCV's priorities next in the 2021 General Assembly will be around the nexus of climate change, environment, transportation, and justice issues. And we believe that the key operative word in that is the word "and." So we'll be working on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Will be reduced, especially through the transportation sector, and also making sure we are bringing to light the undue burden that low-income neighborhoods are having because of pollution. So that's our leading agenda items for sure moving forward. And you know, the national front is definitely part of the problem and part of the solution. We are not seeing leadership at the national level currently on climate change, and therefore the role that the state plays is critical. There's nothing more important than the opportunity for Maryland to advance meaningful and substantial climate change agenda items, especially when the federal government is not. So regardless of what happens in November, we will continue to push Maryland to be a leader in this field, and that's very important. And again, the importance of getting out and voting in November cannot be overstated. We have an aggressive civic engagement program that we're implementing right now. And it's called Your Vote, Our Future. You can go to our website and learn about it, but we're trying to make sure that everybody votes in Maryland and is educated about where, how, and when to do so. So if there's ever a time to really invest in it, it's now. Biggest surprises we found this year compared to past scorecards. That's a great question too. You know, it's hard to do a direct comparison of this year's findings to last year's findings or even previous year's findings because the session ended 3 weeks early and things were compressed. And frankly, we did a fair amount of discernment with our board about how to interpret the early ending of the General Assembly and the impact on our issues, and decided that it was really important to keep the bar high. If there's ever a time where climate and environmental issues should be front and foremost in our community, it is now. As Ramon said, there's a direct link between people's ability to respond to this virus and their overall health and impacts from pollution. And so we decided to hold the bar high. And what surprised us probably the most is that absolutely no climate or transportation bill passed. And when these are the most urgent issues facing our state, there were 690 bills that did pass in the last part of the session there, and there was nothing on climate or transportation, which is frankly both shocking and unacceptable. And Danny, thank you for putting the link in there about our where to find information on our civic engagement work. So that's in the chat box as well.
Yeah, I think we have one final question for Ramon. Do you want to add anything about the priorities for communities of color in regards to the environment for the next legislative session?
Yeah, so I can tell, I have mentioned some of the issues, but yes, I think it's very, very important to do those two, a combination of things. The one is do an assessment, assess what are the level of burdens that are those communities, those low-income communities and communities of color facing. And the second thing that we need to do is reduce emissions. It's very important that we reduce emissions to benefit their health. That is paramount. But it's also very important to take another step, which is bringing sustainable development and economic development to those communities. When we are talking about a just transition and other initiatives, it's very important that we have a combination of those three to make sure that they are better off.
Great. Thank you so much, Ramon and Kim. And I don't see any other questions. Did I miss another one? Okay, great. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for joining us for our 2020 Environmental Scorecard release. I hope you check out all the links in the chat box. I've also emailed you our press release. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Kim or Ramon, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. Thank you all so much and have a great morning. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.